I am here with Pete Ford and Rebecca Krauthamer from Q Secure, and we're going to talk about a recent executive order and its implications for quantum security. So welcome, Rebecca and Pete. Why don't you take a minute to tell us about yourselves, and then we can dig into the topic at hand.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Rebecca, co-founder and chief product officer at Q Secure, and I get the good fortune of working with Pete every day, and we saw early on that this quantum problem is coming down the pipe, and we build solutions around that, protecting government and enterprise.
And I'm Pete Ford. I'm the Senior Vice President for Q Secure's Federal Operations team. And it's really my pleasure to get a chance to increase my IQ by talking to Rebecca as much as possible. And I think the only thing I could add to this, Hugh, if it's a little more flavor, as we go to the government side of the house, the federal operations that we have here. I spent my first career in the Air Force as a fighter pilot, working mostly on advanced technology, next-gen systems, next-gen weapons, next-gen communication protocols and standards. And then when I retired from the Air Force, I went and was a defense industry executive at Northrop and Raytheon. And when I was there, I saw the changes that were coming in the quantum landscape, getting to quantum day, when a quantum computer could break normal encryption, knowing that we're a just-in-time logistics type nation, certainly a defense department, that just fired all kind of flags to me. My goodness, we prep and plan for an operational plan when Congress and the president raise the flag and say we go to war. And then the logistics that we've already put in place get really spun up when we go beforehand. So we need to do something about that now before those vulnerabilities become even more prevalent. So that's when I looked at that and said, I'm signing an NDA with you, Q Secure, because you're a U.S. founded, funded, and focused company that's giving post-quantum comm capability on existing systems, and you're ready to grow for the future. So it's a good timing, and I'm glad the rest of the nation, ideally really the rest of the world, is what the IEEE is calling a quantum decade. This decade is already well underfoot, and it'll be some major sweeping changes, and being ready for them ahead of time is important.
Right. And to just speak a little bit to the quantum threat, for background, the idea of a quantum computer has been around for a while, but in the last decade, we've really made a lot of progress, and these things actually exist. It's sort of like the 1970s of classical computing. A ton of research money is going into developing more and more powerful quantum computers, and they pose such amazing potential for things in AI. My background's more in AI, and that's how I ended up here. Super, super exciting there in chemistry and new materials and all these different areas. But one of the main things we know about quantum computers is that once they reach a certain scale, that scale being about 4,000 qubits, they will definitely break things like RSA, and public key cryptography will become obsolete as it is today. So, and this is a very real threat. This is, something that the U.S. government has put now billions into. China has put, publicly about $15 billion into this, and so it's incredibly important that we get ahead of this threat. Not just because that day is coming, Q day as Pete called it, but because there's the idea of these store now, decrypt later attacks, where data that has a shelf life, sensitive data, national secrets, social security numbers, et cetera, harvested now, decrypted when a quantum computer comes online that's sufficiently powerful. And so that's kind of why, and this leads us into this executive order that Pete's going to go into. That leads us to why this executive order came about. It mandates that these government agencies start to make this upgrade to post-quantum cryptography away from today's current encryption standards. And Pete, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, you hit one part of it. I look at it on both sides. Aside from the fact that obviously it's a fearful thing, there's some major sweeping changes, and the way we've seen information passed in flow is going to have to change in some of that. I don't want any of the listeners or whoever's watching this or hearing this later on to think that's it. Let's just focus on the fear. A quantum computer, there's quantum computing, quantum communication, and quantum sensing are really if you want to break up three different bands. A quantum computer, even before we hit that 4,000 qubits of coherent quantum bits working together to solve non-polynomial factor hard problems, a quantum computer is going to do amazing things. There's a lot of wonderful things that are going to come with this that are going to shape and change a lot. So I don't want any of our listeners or you, Hugh, or anybody out there to go, oh, it's just a fear monger. It's not. There's a lot of great things that are happening. And I'd like us here, especially in America, where we enjoy the freedoms that come with that information flow. I want us to continue to enjoy that freedom. And so when I looked at this post-quantum comm and the modernization that these executive orders pushed up, it was one more way of making sure that information flow was still free. It still had bandwidth. It still had latency. The need for speed, for markets, for information flow, and for what we're doing, that's what I'm really trying to do, is keep with our Q-Secure company, not just for financial, biotech, healthcare, all the markets, but for our federal operations side of the house, keep that same bandwidth and latency out in the information pipelines, free and open and uncontested. And so there, to me, I look at it more of a positive than just working on the fear of what are we going to do when this happens. Obviously, the fear is going to be a driver, but the great parts that come forward are going to be neat too.
Right. Yeah, and to echo that, the threat is very real, but the solution is as well. It's a solved problem as far as how we look at it. So a piece of this puzzle is NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, has for a few years now been running a competition to put in place the next cryptographic algorithms that will replace what we have today. So we work with things like that. And so this problem, while scary, is something that we can solve today.
And so I will add one thing here, Hugh, that's probably worthwhile to, aside from the technology piece, let's look at a peer-to-peer nation interaction. Information and the information that we would hold critical, either as a national security or even some of the financial movement of information or biological, medical, healthcare things. Those are things that are individually private held, but they're also the responsibility of a nation to make sure that it's protected. So on a peer-to-peer course, you can read just about any journal out there, even if it's not one that has to do with defense or federal operations, and recognize that China is going about this significantly different than us. As part of their 14th five-year plan, and they come out with five-year plans, turns out every 5 years. This is the 14th. They made part of this a informationization revolution, and they focused on quantum computing because they know that quantum computer has the capability to decrypt all of the information either stolen or stored. So the reason we want to get ahead of that is we want to stop that day before it starts, so we still keep that flow of information correctly in the right pipe and protect it as a peer-to-peer nation state. But they've already identified who their number one person is doing this. They've identified well over 1,500, shy of 2,000 people that are designed to focus specifically on quantum computing advances. They're working on quantum comms and quantum sensors as well, because they know that's the next breakthrough that's going to change from classical computing to when a qubit moves and does that math a lot faster. So it is very important to us to understand on the federal ops side, when we break down these memos, the May 21 memo and the January 22 memo, there is a peer-to-peer reason we're doing this. We want to keep our critical information from being breached, and we want to make sure that all the unsupported encryption that's legacy or has a lot of holes in it or hasn't been funded at the correct priority, get that back up to a standard so we're no longer vulnerable, or as vulnerable as we could be if we don't do something about it now. So if that's a good start, would you like me to go quickly through those? And do you want me to share a screen or not?
Yeah, go ahead and share the screen. Let's look at this executive order. I mean, we can't go line by line, but just give us the highlights of it, you know.
Okay, see if I have the ability to share. I might not on this particular with the way we are here. If not, hey, there's a share screen. Good. So we'll go through this real quick and let me know if this shows up in a good format for you.
Yeah.
Is that okay? Great. So what I've pulled up here, you see four different sheets here that I pulled up, and I'll go rapidly through them. And if you've ever read these, you know that an exercise in patience is required. You're reading a lot of bureaucratic speak, and I've highlighted the things that I think are most important. Obviously, the date here. This was in May of 21, and it basically says, hey, our cybersecurity is going to require a whole of government and all the people in our nation action to make sure we are protected from bad cyber actors. And we need a more secure cyberspace. That's pretty easy. The part that I'm looking down here and said is the government is going to make bold changes. Now we keep scrolling down a little bit. And the reason I've highlighted this section right here on this page is it talks about the director of budget. In other words, if you're in the federal government, you are interested in show me the money and tell me what you're going to hold me accountable for to Congress and the rest of the branches of government so that I spend our money correctly and that I can justify it, why I'm spending the money like this. So this is where we talk about and the big layout from the May 21 executive order was a ZTA, a zero trust architecture, meaning I want some of those critical cyber vulnerabilities. I want to make sure I keep my root of trust correct. So I know they're protected and also know they're not as vulnerable as they were in the past. So that's the big takeaway from all these. And really what you'll see me highlight here as I go through these other 19 pages is the actual implementation and activities for a zero trust architecture. That's about the biggest thing I'd like to do. But then you see down here, employing encryption for data. That's where I start looking at following why we're getting to this is that's one of the things that we're doing right now with legacy systems. Let me give you a post-quantum or a quantum resilient set of protocols that's going to keep some legacy data on legacy systems more secure with zero trust built into them. Now we move forward. And by the way, the next sheet over here is basically that same thing, only in a little bit easier readable form. If you want to look at it, it comes from the briefing room of the White House, came out the same day. And they're basically talking about, let's remove some of the barriers between government and private. That goes back to that first thing I highlighted. And then, by the way, this is one of the major takeaways: modernize and give me a stronger cybersecurity standards for my federal government. And that includes, once again, they're the words, zero trust cybersecurity market architectures. So now we fast forward to several months later, and let me go back up to the top. This one was the 19 January. You see all the highlighted parts I have in here. So this was an executive order 14028 out of the White House, and it came out actually in top secret SI format. In other words, it actually went into a lot of the details that are classified on how we're going to do this and what parts that we don't want anybody else to know. The one we have here is the unclassified version. So it doesn't cover all the sections. It's only 14 pages, but you see all the number of governmental agencies that are written to in this because action is required of them. So there's the executive order 1428. And it actually starts putting a lot more budgetary details on what's, whys, and when's. When's the most important. So the parts that I've highlighted here, remember this was 19 January, and we're talking right now on 23 March. One of the 60 days was 18 March, 19 March. So we start seeing some different omnibus and congressional actions taken because this is driving some of those results. So time is really important when you pull this out. And that'll be more for you and your readers to go into details on what that's going to mean, remembering that the government works on fiscal years versus calendar years. The part that I like to highlight on this, and then I'll turn the floor back over to Rebecca to go over it, is you see all the pieces of who's responsible for this zero trust architecture and what are the next practices we're leaning into. And I'll highlight down here, this is on page 3 of 14, and it basically says, and I won't read it to everybody, but this is from the president and to the rest of the governmental leaders that are going to be paid to do this and going to be held accountable for doing this. I want a modernization plan. I want post-quantum comm, and I want quantum resilient protocols in place now because I'm too vulnerable. And I have legacy systems that have been underfunded and underprioritized. This is my effort. heads up, I'm going to charge you for this, and we're going to charge for this, and the budget's going to be responsible for this, and Congress is going to ask you about modernization plans, post-quantum comm, and quantum resilient protocols. So that modernization means I want you to consider, what do we do now before Q Day hits? And let's start laying those in. And then the last part I'll leave you here is, we won't go through all of these. Your readers or other people can look at them. I came over here to, let's follow the money. And this is DOD's audit of this past year. And I'll bring you here, page 74. What they've identified, and this is from the auditor, is they have identified the material weaknesses. And guess what they say? Legacy systems. We're not retiring them soon enough. We're not fixing the breaches that are there. Guess what else? We've seen a mismanagement of configuration and security management. So those unsupported encryptions that the president talks about, we find them too. We like to adjust, and we're open and honest. We're required to do this audit, but there's the follow the money. So it's back right there in page 75, and it goes through those. We produce some amazing things in America, but we do need to pay attention to some of those things that are mismanaged or unsupported encryption or legacy systems that haven't been retired. So the last piece is from another group, and it's basically the 18 March omnibus from FY22. And I got this from Deltec. So it basically talks about that exact thing. What are we doing for funding and agency information operations for cybersecurity? And it goes through, you can see the reason I like this one is it talks about Department of Agriculture, Commerce, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Health and Human Services, DHS, HLS, a number of them. So a lot of those in there are basically going, Congress is showing me, and this is what I'm doing to make those monies match. But they all started basically in the classified side right here on 19 January. And if you really follow it back, it was in May. And that matches some peer-to-peer nation state activity that we saw. So I'll stop sharing now.
Okay. So that's really great. So the question is, let's say you're one of these agencies like the Department of Commerce. Let's leave the defense and intelligence aside. You're just a basic. So what do you do now? You get your money, and then what? Are you going to start inventorying your data and figure out what needs to be encrypted, and then implement your new higher level encryption? Like how does that unfold?
Well, I don't want to pretend to speak for any of those professionals that do that for a living and have done it for a while and are good at it. The first thing that most people would think of is, what do I need to do to make sure I abide by that May, and it was reiterated in January, what do I do to stop unsupported encryption, i.e. those things that we know are the most vulnerable? Because a lot of those pages that we went through, and I breezed through them, they were all penalties, or we're not going to pay you if you use this anymore. Or if you have to use unsupported encryption, here's the process you go to get a waiver, and here's how long the waiver lasts, and here's how much money I'm not going to pay you next year if you continue to use it. So it's really a bounded edge of thou shalt nots. So the first thing I do if I'm looking at that is, turns out it's never good to have the president or Congress mad at you when you're in the government and they fund you. So I'd like to keep that funding going. Let me make sure I hit the bounded edge of this road and don't do any of those thou shalt nots. So that means legacy systems need to be replaced, or I need to have end-of-life systems moved out. And I also need to continue to meet the demands of a commerce or a state or a labor or a DHS. While I do that, let me do the not thou shalt nots. Now let me, along this modernization plan, let me move my money and my people and my efforts around to find out which are the first modernization, post-quantum comm, quantum resilient protocols are easiest for me to put in place with existing systems. I.e., I don't have room if I'm the Defense Department, or if I'm commerce or labor or state, to just tear down a complete embassy or pull satellites off of the orbit and put all new satellites up. I need to use the best modernization plan possible to get this in existing system, because it's the best use of my money. And it also gets me in the compliant lane under the executive order that I'm required to in the nearest term. So that's normally the thought process.
Okay. And then does Q Secure have a role to play in this? How do you fit in this story?
We certainly hope to. One of the things that I really like about what we're doing is one, we're ready now before Q Day, which is great. The other great part about Q Secure is when you look at the post-quantum comm companies that are out there, there are few, if any, and I know of one, and that's us. That's a US funded, founded, and focused post-quantum comm, quantum resilient protocols ready right now. And it's also backwards compatible, i.e. when your next, like Rebecca talked about, the next post-quantum algorithms that NIST is putting out. When those come out, those are the next form of post-quantum algorithms. We're still going to be useful there. We're already working with 3 of the 4 right now, and they want to ride on our quantum resilient security layers. So we're ready for the future, but we're also ready to give you something right now that at least shores you up against that Q Day. So that's what we're trying to hand to people and make sure that we give them as much as possible. Like the executive order said, not just to the federal government, but to financial, technical, biotech, healthcare, heck, even crypto wallets, all insurance. A lot of those are still going to have those same set of protocols as a whole of government and a private sector want to be ready prior to Q Day. Plus, we want to be at the market ahead of time. So we keep what keeps us a free nation, information flow free.
Interesting. But so the one, here's my question though, having been around the IT world for a while, is, a legacy replacement can take a really long time. And it's a long, expensive, and aggravating process. So it seems a little bit almost like glib for the government to say, well, in the next 90 days, we need a plan for legacy. That could take 5 years, or something like, so
Right.
How do you think, so is that what you're talking about, is that where waivers are going to come in? Like, what would you do, like, if you were in that position?
On the federal side of the house, as I know several of my friends and former colleagues when I was in service are doing, they're looking at the ones where I go, what are the ones that are going to be out of bounds? Let's at least start the waiver process right now, knowing I'm going to go off-roading. If this is the inbound side of the road, there's going to be some that are off-road all the time. So I need to go ahead and start putting those waivers in place. I'm also going to have to start looking at a funding request to get them back on road next. So those are the first one is just what's off-road, identify it, and ask for funding to get it back on road later. Because like you said, the federal acquisition regulation is a huge ship, and the rudder is about the size of my hand. So it takes it a long time to turn. And then once you do start getting it turned, now all the wakes it causes and all those waivers and the backwards compliance and the standards really do get messy unless you at least have a vision for where you're going.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, maybe you can relate to this as someone who comes out of the Air Force. So in 1945, my father jumped out of a burning B-17 and broke his back landing on the ground in Austria. And he thereafter got a check for $12 a month, a whole 12 from the VA. But that check, I learned later, was even, he got it all the way through the end of his life, was cut off of a VAX system. It was implemented in the 70s. So, I mean, that VAX was turning out those checks, and it's like, they probably still is, and you could go, like, if you go to the Hewlett-Packard show, you could buy like replacement circuitry for the VAX because the software still worked, but the machine was falling apart. So anyway,
you nailed it. I'll have to check. I get that similar, it's a little more than $12 now, but it doesn't feel like that much more, but I'll have to check and see if it comes off the same machine, and maybe we'll compare.
Yeah, no, it's totally true. And that's, we set out because it's, cybersecurity is both not that old and old enough to where we're in a point where the threat landscape evolves so quickly that the infrastructure in place things become legacy very quickly. So we set out to be able to make this upgrade as painless as possible. So that legacy integration piece and so, I started out my career actually on a project for the state of California Social Services Department implementing a new software system. And so, I'm deeply familiar with how things can look and how these upgrades look. Pete, everyone on the team, and that's so yeah, of course, this is going to be a heavy lift, but I think with that sort of design thinking in mind, when you come up with solutions to these new and emerging problems, you can address those and sort of tackle them in a way that doesn't mean this huge overhaul and heavy lift of pulling something out by the roots and then putting something back in.
Oh,
And waiting for it to grow. And I
Waiting
like
for it to grow.
that too. That's great share that you had about your dad. I have an article coming out pretty soon. Matter of fact, I just finished it and made it to our publishers. We have always, and it's really hard not to, gone to war with old systems. If you look at when we hit World War II, if the historians in the crowd look it up, we were still using some things that we used for World War I. Granted, they weren't that far apart, but if you look at what we did, let's take Desert Storm, a new piece. Some of the first aircraft into Iraqi airspace were airplanes called F-4s that we made for Vietnam. We're still flying them. So
Right.
We're going to go to war with legacy equipment. We're going to use legacy equipment. How much more efficient can we make that legacy equipment so that it's less vulnerable and it's that much more useful to us? That's really what we're trying to do, is let's meet some immediate needs and let's make room for the future. And that's really what I like that we're doing. And I like that these executive orders are asking all of the government to do the same.